I think Elden Ring would have been better if instead of all the big open space between points of interest, they reduced the size of the map by like 1/3 and made it more dense with what you are exploring. Whoa, hot take. Let's step back and start again. Elden Ring, an absolute, almost masterpiece. Elden Ring has been out for a while, and while there have been countless others that have put out reviews, I also wanted to do one. Why? I don't know. I just finished the game and have a lot of thoughts, so we are going to deep dive into them all. We're going to talk about the more fun things like the story, combat, bosses, and exploration, and the less fun things but equally important things like NPC quests and other criticisms. Overall, we're going to try and cover everything and give a real in-depth review of the game for those interested. Finally, like the title mentions, there will be spoilers of almost everything in the game, and I will be using spoiler-filled footage, so for those who don't want to be told spoilers, now's a good chance to watch the intro and drop a like and comment. And for those who don't want to see the spoilers but want to listen, time to treat this video like a podcast. Without further ado, let's get into it. The Elden Ring experience is a truly personal experience, and one that can only be done truly once. It's a game set to awe the player with the scope of the world, the wonders you see, and the horror you fight. It's a lonely story set for a single player experience. It's crafted around the idea of making you feel utterly on your own, yet gives enough so that you may persevere and overcome the obstacles in front of you. Elden Ring does so many things great, like the combat and the lore of the world, but falls short on some key aspects, especially the exploration in my opinion. However, and this is important, I think the good outshines the bad here, and without a doubt, Elden Ring has been one of the best single-player RPGs I've played in the last few years, and honestly just one of the best games I've played in the last few years. If you're a Soulsborne fan, you'll love this. If you're an RPG fan, you'll love this. If you're just a fan of video games and amazingness, you'll love this. The game has its flaws, as we'll go into, but overall it's just amazing. So, let's get into it, starting off with the story. Like all Soulsborne games, the story is shown and discovered, but not really told, but that's never a bad thing. I will say before diving into the story of Elden Ring, this game by far gives the most information about what's going on compared to other Soulsborne. This may be because of George R.R. Martin's involvement, so they wanted to make sure the story was more known, but either way it is. And we know a lot, and I absolutely love the story. For those who don't know, whenever I get into a video game, one of the first things I look for is good lore. From the old days of getting really into Star Wars lore because of Knights of the Old Republic, to more recently diving in deep into the lore of New World. It's hard for me to invest myself into a game that doesn't invest in a story. Obviously there are exceptions to this, but for a game like an RPG or MMO or whatnot, I have to like what's going on or I just don't get immersed and never finish playing it. For Elden Ring, I went in blind at the beginning, but got hooked on the initial immersion and I wanted to know what was going on. I watched videos and TikToks and read item descriptions and I just fell in love. The lore of the world is absolutely excellent, from the beginning with the Elden Ring to the Shattering and the great saga of Radon and Melania to up where we are now. I'm totally invested. It is some of the best world building I've ever seen in a video game, period, let alone top world building in fiction. What they set up is beautiful and it's told in such an interactive way as you get to see these locations as you explore around and interact with and battle characters you've learned about. I'll touch more on the exploration later. So the lore, amazing. The actual story though, sadly, it's a bit lackluster compared to the grandeur that is the lore. For quick clarification here, when I speak about lore, I'm talking about the setup story, what's happened already, and information of the established characters and world. When I talk about story, I'm talking about the story that we as players go through. And it's good, but nothing special like the lore of the world. Quite honestly, it's a pretty simple hero's journey. We are the lowest of the low tarnished who rise up from nothing to become something great like the Elden Lord. Obviously there's a bit more going on and speculations being had, especially with everything going on with Queen Marika, but that's the basic premise. You travel the lands to battle great beings who hold shards of your MacGuffin. Then you win when you get all the pieces of the MacGuffin to then make the MacGuffin. That's the core story. There's no major plot twist in the story, and honestly the story itself just feels like a vessel to tell the story of the lore. Now, with lore like Elden Ring, this isn't necessarily a problem. It's vast and complicated, and if they tried to throw everything they did at us in the lore with a very in-depth and complicated story, it probably would have been too much. But objectively speaking, the story in this game is nothing groundbreaking. They intentionally keep it simple because they clearly wanted exploration and gameplay to be the main focus, and just funneled the story to be more simple so you can do those things. And while I absolutely love the lore, this did leave some bad taste in my mouth. A bit of longing for something greater that happened in the story. And there are small instances of this happening in two forms. The first is what happens with Melina. Your story is invested in hers of getting her to the Erd Tree and then letting her sacrifice herself, or not, to burn it all down. It was a touching story within the main story. The second form is honestly the NPC stories. Questing to become a Blood Knight with Vare, or helping Ranni become to greater power, or just complete the story of Millicent is where the true story of Elden Ring is told. They take advantage of their in-depth lore and crazy amount of characters to truly let you invest yourself into those characters' stories. I remember more about these side stories than I really do about any main story elements. Here I do want to sidetrack though that the method of telling the NPC stories is awful. I know Soulsborne fans hate the idea of a quest log and that would just break what they want in these games, but trying to keep track of all the NPC quests and hell even find where to go next with them was honestly just bad. Just bad. The story's great. The storytelling method of talking to one random NPC and then somehow finding them in a completely other random place was near impossible unless you had the Elden Ring wiki up on the second window of your computer. But luckily the content itself was worth having that wiki up. Otherwise, I don't know how you can keep track of everything in such a vast open world, and with the next spots for quests sometimes being in absurd spots. As a whole, the narrative backdrop of this world was immense and amazing, and in my opinion the best part of the game. But then again, I'm just a sucker for lore. This also leads into talking about the exploration component of the game, which compared to the scenery and lore, honestly was lackluster. I know this might be a controversial statement, but the open world of Elden Ring, to me, felt empty. Even more controversial, I think Elden Ring would have been better if instead of all the big open space between points of interest, they reduced the size of the map by like 1/3 and made it more dense with what you are exploring. While I enjoyed galloping on Torrent, I got to a point in the game where I was just going from point A to point B. Exploring itself was fun at first, but to be frank, a lot of dungeons just had poor rewards, and exploration did not do a job of rewarding players, so I lost interest in just randomly exploring. Instead, I found out what I needed for my build and went to do that. That's my other major criticism. Rewards in this game just never felt good. Unless there's something I intentionally needed, I just felt like I got a lot of useless items, and that really deterred me from wanting to explore, as I just didn't feel like there was a purpose to it. After I finished Limgrave and Caden, I didn't really have the interest in just random exploration. Liurnia onwards, I explored only if I had a major draw to it or if it was associated to a side quest I was doing. And I'm glad the side quests force you to go all over the map, because otherwise I definitely had missed so many locations. But like I said before, I wish it was a bit more clear on where they were wanting you to go and to help you remember what was said. Either way, the exploration in Elden Ring honestly was just flat. A gorgeous, stunning flat, but flat nonetheless. On the bright side of the exploration though, it led to combat, and oh boy, was Elden Ring's combat just amazing. For me, and I'm sure that almost everyone else, this was the other greatest part of Elden Ring. Quite simply, it was just good. It was. There's no denying it. The combat was fluid, the hitboxes near perfect, and each weapon had a way of feeling unique, even if only by a little. Trying different builds and exploring the combat with them is the highlight of this game's replayability. You can go high in Dex and Arcana and do a variety of bleed builds, or become a Master Mage, or become Guts from Berserk, or anything in between or outside those options. It really has what feels to be an endless combination, especially when you add in shields, dual wielding, two-handed and melee versus ranged possibilities. In my opinion, no game has made me feel so free with the combat before. I really could become whatever type of warrior I wanted to. For my first playthrough, I decided to go a bleed build, rocking 2 double-ended blades with high dex and bleed. I think for my next build, I'm going to go and try to recreate Radahn. Why? Because I can, and it's glorious. Beyond the builds for combat, the actual combat itself is so fluid and engaging. From fighting simple skeleton warriors to demigods, there's an air of uniqueness with each enemy type that you must overcome and understand to win. The combat itself has a few options that give it depth. Attack, dodge roll, block, parry, and finding out what works in certain situations feels amazing. Honestly, the euphoria I felt when I was able to first dodge past Renala's laser beam or Melania's water dance move, just kidding, I never dodged that, was just absurd. Without a doubt, I just wanted to fight monsters, and it was the perfect game at doing so. However, there is one main error with the combat, and that is the repetitiveness of some enemy types. There's no doubt in my mind that the project of Elden Ring maybe was just too ambitious for what From Software was able to do in their time frame, as there are obvious repetitions of monsters within the world that are just reskinned versions of their counterpart. That isn't necessarily a bad thing, especially in regards to exact copies like the Tree Sentinel, which is just a mile marker so that you could see a boss at the beginning that's super hard, but in late game you could take on 2+ more of them, right? But when monsters are supposed to be different but clearly are the same, that definitely dims some excitement. But this wasn't a super obvious thing that happened and never really took me that much out of my engagement. Beyond the normal mobs, there are obviously also the bosses of the world. Honestly, not going to go too deep into the bosses as I think that's been talked about a lot, but I'll say a few things. First things first, I just want to share my favorite bosses because I'm excited and want to. My top 5 from 5 to 1 are Rykard, Lord of Blasphemy, Margit the Fell Omen, Dragon Lord Placidusix, Mohg, Lord of Blood, and my number 1 favorite boss fight was Star Scourge Radahn. The bosses in this game are without a doubt the peak of the playable content. They are the light that guides you from zone to zone for what you hope to find. A horribly hard fight that you have to master and strengthen to win. Boss fights are what people really play Soulsborne games for, and this game delivered with some amazing ones. Even past the ones in my top 5, there are more amazing fights. Here's my tier list actually of the fights. I felt very few fights, unless intentional like Margit and Morgott, were that similar. They all had unique styles and movesets and strengths and weaknesses that you had to figure out to win. And while some were just horrible, looking at you Gotskin Duo, others set a new level for which I will forever compare any future game boss to. In conclusion, I loved Elden Ring. I really did, and if anyone wants to play the game, please do. However, I have to warn you now, I say loved, and I mean it, but it's not an active love. And the reason being is the exploration of the game doesn't perform past the first playthrough. This is a game you really play through once, maybe 1 or 2 shorter main boss runs to try different builds, but otherwise the game can only be experienced at its best the first time. So I loved it, but I feel like I can no longer play the game as I don't want to tarnish the memories I have of the game. But who knows, maybe I will play the game again, as I am tarnished.